I'd like to invite you to join with me for just a moment in a time of relaxation. For many persons, the weeks of Lent are times of commitment, times of dedication toward personal growth and overcoming. So regardless of what your particular approach to the coming weeks may be, whether it may be just the same as any other time, or whether you are into some sort of a religious dedication, perhaps you'd like to consider this tonight as a time of recommitment. And I love those words, commit thy way unto the Lord. It's an old traditional thought, but it has great significance. If we think of ourselves as being involved in a quest for truth, for self-realization, for expansion of awareness, and we know that every day of our lives we are walking a way that is fraught with all sorts of lures that distract our attention from the highway, so that it might be important for us to make this commitment. So within your own consciousness and in your own words, perhaps you would like to express a thought, something like, I commit myself in all of my efforts in the days and perhaps the weeks ahead to walk the highway of truth, to live in accordance with spiritual law as I know it to the fullest of my being. I now commit myself, commit my way. Put it in your own language. Reflect on it for just a moment. And the other part of that beautiful scriptural statement is, commit thy way unto the Lord, and he will bring it to pass. That's the assurance. When we make our commitment to the law, the result is a constant, supportive process to strengthen us and to guide us and to give us all that we need to fulfill that which we make a commitment toward. It's a beautiful realization. And I've always loved that concept, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. And I like this because of an implication that goes far beyond the normal procrastination involved. The spirit is willing, meaning that God within you, the divine resource, always wills direction and help to you. It is instant, constant, and eternal, a supportive process that is ever within you. And then I think the flesh is weak in terms of my human consciousness, the limitations of my negative awareness actually cannot stand up before this tremendous will of the Spirit. The Spirit is willing, but the flesh of the human man is weak. And therefore my willfulness turns into willingness. And I let the will of the Spirit guide me and direct me in the highway of truth. I commit my way unto the Lord, and he shall bring it to pass. We give thanks for this. Amen. All right, now we're going to consider some thoughts on 7 main aspects of truth. As I'm sure most of you know, tomorrow is the beginning of Lent. For many people, Lent is a very important time. At least it's a time that one enters into dutifully, if not enthusiastically. Today, I'm sure you may also be aware of the fact today is the time of Mardi Gras. You probably are aware of the fact also that Mardi Gras literally means Fat Tuesday or Greasy Tuesday. And of course, this goes from the long tradition of very deep involvement in penance and fasting and self-discipline over the weeks of Lent. And so the desire to have one last fling before one gets involved into all this, and so it's a time of rejoicing and usually overeating and doing all the things that starting tomorrow you're not going to do, you know. Well, you may or may not be involved in this type of a commitment, but it is kind of interesting, and I think perhaps in passing we might just look at it, that many folks tomorrow will be wearing the sign of the ashes on the forehead, where the priest, either in Latin or in English will say, "Remember, man, that thou art ash, and unto dust thou wilt return." And this is a very sincere thing, and in no way I mean to derogate the whole idea. It is strange, however, that in the evolution of this Lenten practice, it has gone full circle right back to the very thing that Jesus was quite critical about, because when Jesus had some quite stirring things to say about the Pharisees and their practices and the way in which they did most things to be seen, he said, "When ye fast, be not as the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that they may be seen of men to fast." And then he goes on to say, "When you fast, wash your face clean, and anoint yourself with oil." In other words, that was the method of having your face clean and washed. And then he said, and do your fasting to yourself and God alone. So it's interesting how practices, religious practices, can kind of get carried out of context and become, at least to some persons, a kind of a perfunctory practice that you do because that's what you're supposed to do. But again, Lent can be a very vital and a very meaningful experience, regardless of what a person's religious motivations may be. It can be a time of extreme important self-examination and self-discipline, and we're going to look at it on that basis. And as I say, whether you're interested in Lent or just interested in having a growth experience during a limited period of time, it really makes very little difference, but at least we can work at it together. So what we're going to try to do during this period is to look at certain aspects of the jewel of truth or metaphysics, and we're going to refer to them on the basis of fundamental laws, and we're going to try to understand them to a certain degree, at least challenge ourselves to see them in a larger context, and then give ourselves some homework to do in terms of really working at it. Now, I said we'll look at the jewel of truth from many facets. I want to make that as a rather important point relative to the idea of the 7 laws. The 7 main aspects we're going to refer to them as fundamental laws. Every once in a while someone says, I just wish that we could outline one by one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever, the fundamental laws of life, the laws of the universe. Well, I'm going to be very honest about it. The laws of metaphysics are going to be articulated pretty much in the way in which the teacher or the writer wants to express them. You look at the jewel of truth, and depending upon your vantage point, you're going to see the sparkle, and the diamond has many, many, many facets. And any one of them, if you're looking at it at a particular vantage point, is going to dazzle you. And so in that sense, any way we look at the jewel of metaphysics, we can see it in terms of fundamental law, and we can think of it in an extremely emphatic way as a fundamental law of truth. Actually, the only real law involved in metaphysics or truth is oneness or wholeness. But in seeking to understand this and relating it to our own experience, we may see it and think of it and work with it in terms of many, many laws. So I want to very honestly say that the 7 laws that I'm going to deal with are arbitrary selections in terms of ways in which we're going to look at the jewel of truth. Now that's being very honest. Otherwise I could say these are the laws of truth. Anything else anyone else tells you, it doesn't count, you see. But let's be honest about it. All right. Now we're going to think a little bit about the whole idea of truth in terms of what it is and how it works in individual consciousness. We use terms such as metaphysics and new thought and truth and all sorts of other organizational names beyond that. Metaphysics, basically, according to the encyclopedia or the dictionary definition, refers to the science of first principles. The metaphysical student or the student of truth is one who is persistent in his attempt to find the underlying principle of causation behind every manifestation. In other words, it is the awareness that beyond the great diversity of life and beyond the many changing experiences of human unfoldment, there is that which is changeless. There is that which is whole. There's that which is one. And the truth then becomes a kind of a language that articulates this metaphysical concept, but a language of ideas in motion, not just a language of words. I think so often there is a tendency, even as we referred to how Orthodox Christianity or Orthodox religion of any kind so often tends to get away from its original intent. So in metaphysics, we tend sometimes to evolve in verbalisms, so that in time we say, this is the truth, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and we have a book, and this is the truth, this is the law, the principle of metaphysics. Learn this, study this, get this into your consciousness, and you have it all. Well, if you take any set series of metaphysical truths, no matter how they are expressed, and assume that that's the end and all of truth, and insist that there's nothing else, then suddenly you've created a box and walled yourself in. And there's very little hope for you or help for you. There's very little growth for you. Now that may be startling to you, because truth is not words. The moment you capture or seek to capture the insight of truth into a set statement or a set series of propositions, you've lost it. As the ancients used to say, to define a thing is to limit it. If you can define it, if you can say this is it, if you can have a set series of words, someone asks you, what is truth? What is metaphysics? What is unity? And if you can give them the answer in 3 or 4 easy sentences, and you're absolutely satisfied that that's what it's all about, then the fact is you probably don't know what it's all about yourself, you see. It's not that simple. It cannot be actually presented in a series of statements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a non-verbal expression of a divine force. Remember when Jesus said to Pilate, I came to bear witness to the truth, and Pilate said, what is truth? Beautifully, it says, he opened not his mouth. One time he didn't say a thing. And that was his answer. That was his answer. You would assume that he didn't answer because he was beaten, he'd been scourged, he was defeated, he was humiliated. That isn't it at all. He opened not his mouth when he was asked what is truth. The reason was, in his unfolding consciousness, he was actually expressing or articulating the truth in the stand he was taking, in the consciousness that he was projecting. And if Pilate couldn't sense that or see it, then Jesus could have given a sermon on, instead of the Sermon on the Mount, he could have given the sermon before Pilate. And it would have been a long series of definitions, but it would only have served to confuse rather than to articulate or clarify, you see. So that truth is the underlying reality. You can try to put it into words, and we spend an awful lot of time. I spend most of my life trying to put it into words. And some people say, well, how do you find so many things to say? Well, the point is, if you keep looking at it with an open mind, there are more things to say about it. And the more you say about it, the more you find that it's endless. There's no end to it. Truth is an underlying reality. We have the problem, you see, of perception. We tend to see things in part. We see things as they appear outwardly. Remember, Jesus says, judge not according to appearances. And yet, we see through the eyes, and so we're constantly seeing things as they are. And so we have a continuing problem in our own experience. And the problem is we must try to make an adjustment in consciousness so that what we see out here becomes only a surface expression of something else that is true, and sometimes even a perverted expression of something else that is true. It's like the early days of the awareness that the earth was not flat, but it was round. And after Columbus had discovered America, and there was gradually became this tremendous idea that swept through the scientific community and then gradually swept through the awareness of people on the street. It is probably true that for a long time after that, leading right up to our day, and if we're honest and perceptive, we'll see that it's still a problem with us. People, as they stood out of doors and looked at the sun, and they could see the sun rise in one part of the horizon and then move across the sky toward the end of the day, they probably had to keep telling themselves, the sun is not really moving. We're moving. The sun is standing still, you see. And yet, seeing is believing. I see it moving, but it's not really moving. And people probably had to continually tell them that. Now, have you ever had that experience yourself when you've been out of doors and you've perhaps been out in the sun for a good while and you've very quickly seen the sun move from one position to another, and there is that sense, that feeling that the sun is actually moving? And yet if you're really alert, you remind yourself, but the sun isn't moving. So that in the same sense, when we see with the eye alone, we perceive only part of the picture. Remember, Paul says we see in part. Then he says, when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When that which is perfect is come means when suddenly I get the awareness of the whole picture, then suddenly the partial experience is seen only as a partial experience, seen in the context of the whole, and all limited aspects of the partial, that which would tend to say, you can't do this, this is the end of the road, is done away, because we see the larger whole, you see. And this is what happens when one becomes convicted of the truth. Truth is the underlying reality. It helps us to know the truth about things. We use this term, know the truth. It's become almost a cliche, but it's a very important one. Let's know the truth about this. What do you mean by that? It's a problem. It's an experience of illness or the threatened loss of a job or some financial problem or whatever. Let's know the truth about this. Well, what does it mean? To relate to the underlying reality. And what is the underlying reality? Well, think, for instance, the classic illustration. Think of an acorn. I hold an acorn in my hand and say, let's know the truth about the acorn. What is the truth about the acorn? Well, actually, if you stop and think about it, you know that an acorn is really an oak tree. It's hard to see that. It's hard to convince a child that, because we're so involved in the seeing is believing context that here it is. There's no oak tree there, but it is an oak tree. If it isn't an oak tree, how can it become one? You see, if it's not involved, how can it evolve? Where is the oak tree? Well, obviously, you can get into all sorts of biological ramifications of this, but the important thing is that in a non-material sense, the oak tree is the reality of the seed. What is the truth about you and about me? The truth about you and about me is that we're spiritual beings. We're whole creatures. And we're spiritual beings and whole creatures all the time, not just when we're knowing the truth about it. And no matter what the outer appearance is, a person may be sick, he may be afflicted, he may be experiencing all sorts of difficulties in his life, he may be perverted, he may be expressing evil ways, or he may be the brunt of some evil expressions against him, but in every case, he's whole. That's the truth. You can't see it, it's not manifesting, but this is where there must be a regulation in consciousness, the same way as when it appears that the sun is moving across the across the sky. It really isn't, because I know the earth is moving. I'm not seeing the whole picture. So now I must know that even though there seems to be deterioration and limitation and injustice and so forth, yet the underlying reality is that I'm a whole creature. I live in a spiritual universe. I'm one with the divine flow. Now, that's not the easiest thing to know. And knowing the truth is not easy, really. If we're going to do it, not so much just in saying a lot of words, but to know it in terms of getting our minds centered upon it, so that suddenly we can see the whole picture in an entirely different way. Well, this is what we're into when we talk about truth or talk about knowing the truth. Now, the first step of this 7 main aspects of truth, which again are 7 ways in which we'll see the jewel, we're dealing with the law of being. And what we're going to perspective of the whole. Now, it's one thing to say, well, the whole is the whole, and what else is there? But it's another thing to say that God is the whole. And the reason for that is most of us have spent a big part of our lives being conditioned to the dualistic structure, to a sense of separation. So that even though we use metaphysical terms and talk about the omnipresence of God, and God is all, and God is love, and so forth, and God is everywhere, and God is manifesting in me, and so forth. Yet, so often, we're doing all of this with the intellect. And yet, something within us, deep in the feeling center, which is related to a subconscious belief of this separation with God, we still feel separated. And this is so definitely proven out in cases when we become very disturbed or anxious, and when we are praying or treating or whatever. Even though we use the metaphysical formulas, there's a tendency, if we're really very alert and look at ourselves very carefully, there's a tendency toward dealing, even in metaphysical terms, dealing with God as if God were someone to talk to. We say the truth, we know the truth about this, and yet sometimes subconsciously, we're knowing the truth in words, hoping that God will listen to the truth that we're knowing so that he will do what we're telling him he's supposed to be. Now, this is all very subconscious, but it's important that we kind of look at this. So that when we talk about the law of being, we're going back, we might say, to the Genesis story and the first words of the Bible, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. And we like to make it very clear that this is not talking about a beginning in time. Because this is why so many people have had trouble with the creation story, because it's been dealt with in terms of time. The 7 days of creation have nothing whatever to do with periods of time, not even eons of time. It's talking about stages in the spiritual unfolding process. It has nothing to do with time. It has more or less to do with depth in consciousness. So the beginning doesn't mean a starting point back there in 0 years. Actually, in the Greek, the term is in principio, in principle. So it refers not to a starting point in terms of a place back there, but a starting point in terms of a level of consciousness. It's what the modern theologians refer to as the ground of being. The beginning of a building is the foundation. Now, we might think of the beginning of a building as the date they started construction. But in terms of the creative process, in the beginning God, the beginning is the foundation, or the rock on which the foundation is built. This is the beginning. And then the structure rises from that. And whether it takes 7 days or 7 years or 7,000 years to erect the building, the important thing is it's built on a solid foundation of principle. Now, when we understand this, then we begin to see the need in consciousness to make a regulation, an adjustment, so that we are constantly dealing with principle rather than with personality or with an individualized expression of God somewhere at some point in time. So we're thinking about God in terms of being. Capital B, capital E, capital I, capital N, capital G. Being. Being. In other words, we must try to think of God, as it were, of reality in the largest possible context. And the largest possible context is very simply the whole. The whole, the allness, everything. I had a letter one time from a man who said, I don't know, these New Thought people, you're always trying to destroy God by reducing him to principle. He said, you have taken away our Lord. And I felt, first of all, kind of sort of facetious about the thing, because if anyone can destroy another person's God by giving some new insights in it, then the person didn't have anything in the first place, except an intellectual construct. He had some ideas, some theological propositions that he'd accepted. But if one has really an awareness of God, a close feeling about God, even if it's a personal God somewhere beyond the clouds, nobody's going to destroy it, no matter what he says. Nobody's going to take away his Lord. So in a sense, it kind of indicates that many persons who are into religion in one way or another and have definite convictions about the idea of God quite often feel very insecure about it, and therefore their concept of God doesn't always stand up to the light of reason, the light of consciousness, or whatever. But let's just react to this man's statement of reducing God to principle. The important thing is not reducing God, but expanding God. Teilhard de Chardin talks about this in his Divine Milieu. I'm sure many of you have read the work, and it's a very significant one. But he talks about how when you begin to get this larger sense, this more cosmic sense of reality, that suddenly you find, and this is something coming from a Catholic priest, he says, suddenly you find that there's nowhere to bow down and worship him, not even in yourself. There's nothing left to worship. There's nothing left to pray to. There's nothing left to talk to. Now this is interesting. But you see, it means that you've expanded the awareness of reality, the awareness of God, to the point where it really becomes allness. And in the Psalms, for instance, there is this thought which has been put into hymns and in beautiful religious solos and so forth of magnify the Lord. A beautiful thought, and it's used so often in religion. I will magnify the Lord. Magnify the Lord, O my soul. We hear this over and over and over again. And we have been given the connotation, or it has evolved at least, that to magnify the Lord means to praise the Lord, to glorify the Lord, to flatter the Lord. I will magnify the Lord. Oh God, you're big and mighty and wonderful and so forth. That isn't what magnify means. Magnify means to make big. You see? And so we've in a sense been misled in the sense of constantly praising and flattering something which is out of our own intellect, the idea of God out there somewhere, which we've personalized, whereas all the while the challenge is to magnify, 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 get a larger and larger and larger and larger concept until suddenly we have the whole. Now we can understand or begin to deal with being, because in being, there's no room for limitation, there's no room for separation, there's no room for sickness, there's no room for evil. All of these things which we deal with, they don't exist in the whole, except as aberrations of the whole. And it's not to say that nobody is ever sick and nobody is ever evil at all. But it implies that there is always a whole, the allness of things, the beingness of God, which is the underlying reality, and therefore which is the key to betterment, the key to growth, the key to spiritual healing, if you will, the key to guidance and direction, the key to overcoming, which is always present. And then suddenly when we deal with God in this larger context, as the poet says, closer is he than breathing, and nearer than hands and feet. Just the opposite of taking away our Lord, suddenly we have a very close present relationship with the Lord, but the Lord is divine law. It's not that which judges. It's not that which sits up there in the clouds and writes all these sins in the little black book, and you spend all of your life, but you'll never really be able to erase all those things. Oh God, if you'd just forgive me, you see. It's not that at all. All that is dissolved. You realize then that you exist as an individualized expression of a wholeness, of an infinite mind process. And you know that you can no more be separated from being, or from God, or from the wholeness of the infinite, than a smile could be separated from a face. Just think about that for a moment. What is a smile? Well, you can describe a smile, you can write poetry about it and songs about it, and there have been poems and songs written about it, and they're beautiful. But then what is a smile? Can you take a smile off? We talk about wipe that smile off your face. Can you actually wipe it off? Can you take it off? Can you take the smile out and set it up out here and look at it? What is a smile? A smile is your face expressing as a smile, right? And you can't have one without the other. There's no way you can take the smile out of the face. It's like the wave in the ocean. What is a wave? I dealt with this in my little book, Life is for Living. It's always been a very meaningful illustration to me. What is a wave? A wave, you see the giant waves that the surf riders do such tremendous things on. It's poetry in motion, and you'd almost think of that wave as an entity. But what is a wave? A wave is the ocean at that moment forming itself as a wave. You can't take the wave out of the ocean. And in the same sense, there's no way that you can be taken out, or I can be taken out of being, out of the allness of God. No way. Because what am I? I am the allness of God expressing himself, itself, herself, if you will, as me. Or I am being, capital B, capital E, capital I, capital N, capital G. Get that in your mind. I am being me. That's the truth about me. That's the truth about you. You are being you. You see, you are a wave. You are a smile on the face of God. You are a wave in the great ocean of the infinite. You are infinite being in the process of articulating itself as you. You are being you. Now, this is not the easiest thing in the world to get into our consciousness. As I say, we may say, oh, that's old hat in terms of the intellectual perception of metaphysics, but in terms of the deep feeling awareness of relationship to the infinite, watch yourself the next time you have any kind of a prayer treatment and see how carefully you phrase the words and how much you get that thought of, as if perhaps God will hear me and make this thing work right and so forth, and I've prayed about this, I just hope that I'm lucky, and so forth. There's this sense of separation, rather than realizing that each of us is the activity of infinite being in the process of manifesting itself as us, and there's no way we can be separated. Therefore, as I say so often, prayer, if we're going to pray scientifically, if we're going to pray in the context of the whole, then there's nowhere that we can reach out to in prayer, and there's no one to pray to. That's Teilhard de Chardin's words. I agree with him very definitely. So prayer should not be to God at all. There's no point in praying to God, because where is he? Who do I pray to? If God is the allness, if the smile is the expression of the face, and the smile is considered as a personality of its own, does the smile pray to the body, pray to the person? The smile is the face, expressing as a smile. Do you pray to God? No. You pray from the consciousness of God. You pray from the consciousness of being. Your prayer, then, is a process of knowing the truth, knowing the underlying reality, knowing that you are an individualized expression of the divine process, that the allness of the infinite is manifest in you. And your prayer and your treatment is not to make something happen, not to deal with divine law. You see, so often we in metaphysics, we do an interesting little game of substitution. We say, oh, I don't think of God as a person, I think of God as law. Well, that's fine, that's beautiful. So now I pray to the law. Well, it's the same old thing. You may put a new face on him. That's what Jesus talked about, putting new wine in old wineskins. You know, you've erased the old picture and you've created a new picture, which now is called principle, or you've called him divine mind, or cosmic force or whatever, but as long as you deal with it out here, then you're still in the same old bag, you see. So the point is we need to try to get away from this dualistic structure which is so much an influence in our consciousness. And I don't think we should just say, well, that doesn't bother me because I've been studying truth for 30 years. The fact is I've known an awful lot of people who have been studying truth for 30 years, including myself, which is a lot more than 30 years. And I can quite often see evidences in myself as well as in others in certain times when this old dualistic bugaboo rears its ugly head. So that we can never assume that we've erased this old thought. We must constantly be working to get a new insight, a new awareness. You go back into the Bible, and the Bible, I think, is a good illustration of the problems we have with this concept, because many of us have been reared on the idea that the Bible is God's Word, so you read the Bible for your divine inspiration. Well, I say if you don't have inspiration in consciousness, if you don't have a sense of being inspirited by the divine process in yourself before you read the Bible might be a source of confusion rather than help. And that may surprise some of our good fundamentalist friends, because we've accepted the Bible as God's holy word. Well, there is certainly an underlying thread of the Word of God and the Word of truth in the Bible, but one has to be able to get into the same consciousness of inspiration to read it as the person was when he wrote it. And that takes a lot of doing sometimes. But also, one must be able to discern between that in the Bible which is the thread of truth and that which is simply the story of people who are floundering trying to find the thread of truth. And the classic example of that is the book of Psalms. The Psalms not only contain inspiration, but they contain poems of discouragement. And if you read the poems of discouragement as inspiration, you're going to be confused, you see. And the Bible also deals with the articulated expressions of a people who were just recently removed from paganism and from the belief in all sorts of gods and creatures. And so their leaders came along and were constantly trying to give them a new insight. Sometimes the leaders had a marvelous consciousness. Sometimes they just had an intuitive awareness of a greater consciousness. So they were trying to get them into this awareness of one God, but they were forever going back into old ways and old concepts. So in the beginning, in pre-Mosaic Israel, and going back into the development of the Scriptures, you have God attached to places and trees and wells and altars and all sorts of things. And then Moses came along with his greater insight, and certainly Moses was along the way toward getting a higher awareness, but Moses himself didn't always follow through on it. But Moses gave them the symbol of the ark. And the ark was sort of that which housed God. And they took the ark with them everywhere they would go. They carried the ark into battle, and it became rather ludicrous, of course, because it was like the kids' game Capture the Flag. If they lost their ark, then they were done, because they didn't have their God anymore, and their God could very easily be stolen and destroyed and captured. So later they evolved into a little more sophisticated system, and they built the temple to house the ark. And so the temple became, and still remains for many people, the house of the Lord. The ark was the inner sanctum in the temple, and so today, as has been down through all the years, millions and millions of people stream in a disciplined and committed way into their temple and their synagogue and their churches and so forth to get close to God. Because that's where God is. You go to church to get close to God, right? Wrong. But that's the delusion that people have been subjected to as a result of this carryover of the old anthropomorphic idea of God. I love that thought of Henry Drummond, who says, and he was, I think this at least vindicates him in part, he was a Methodist Presbyterian minister, at the same time of being a physicist at the university in Edinburgh, in Glasgow. He said, the main purpose of the church is to help people to get along without it. Now, he wasn't, you see, talking about the destruction of the church, but he was challenging people to realize that the purpose of the church is not to set itself up as the truth or as the place where you find God, but to get about its work of helping people to understand their own relationship and to know that if there is an ark of the Lord, it is within. Not out here in a church, not in any special shrine or special place in the world. The ground on which you stand is holy ground. Wherever you are, God is. And God is there because you're there. Not because somebody says it or somebody blesses you and says, I put my hands upon you, now the presence of God is in you. The presence of God is in you, and you know it because you're there. Because you are being you. You may not always be aware of it. You may not always express it fully. You may see in part. You may frustrate it. As we're told in the Old Testament, behold, God created man upright, but he has sought out many inventions, or another translation says he's created many devices. So each person is created as an individualized expression of the infinite creative process, but in his own limited consciousness. He doesn't see this. He distorts the vision, and so he thinks of all sorts of terrible things as a part of his life. And so that which he thinks he is as far as he's concerned. And so if he thinks he's been unjustly treated, if he thinks he's ill, if he thinks that God has forsaken him, then as far as his consciousness is concerned, that's exactly the way it'll be. But it never alters the truth. The truth is always the underlying reality. The truth is he's always a spiritual being, and therein lies the key to his wholeness and the key to his overcoming. Meister Eckhart, that little parish priest who incidentally ultimately became one of the great respected philosophers of medieval times, and who had the most marvelous insight into the transcendental awareness of life, into the fundamental truths, and had a great consciousness of this thought that we call being. He says, if God is all existence, it is impossible that anything should exist apart from him, for this thing would be outside being. All things, therefore, in their substance are themselves God. Whatever else they possess in time or in space is only an appearance. I've always said that it's one of the great miracles of all time that Meister Eckhart wasn't burnt at the stake, because he expressed some vital metaphysical principles in a time when it was rank heresy and when they didn't have much patience with heretics in the church. But I think the reason that he was overlooked in this sense is probably twofold. One, because he was such a loving creature, and people just loved him no matter what. And even in times when the church tried to put him down or to burn him up, one or the other, his congregation was so much behind him because they loved him. But secondly, I think that basically the reason he wasn't touched in spite of these great truths is because I don't think they understood what he was talking about. It was so wild and so transcendental that I don't think very few people really understood. So the point is, until we realize the beingness, if you will, of the infinite, then God is not great enough. And one of the tests that we have, if you have ever found yourself even tempted, and you don't have to tell anybody, but be honest with yourself, even tempted to say, oh, I don't know, if this truth is all it's cracked up to be, and if God is an omnipresent force that we're told he is, I can't understand how this could happen. Have you ever had such a thought about yourself, or about an airplane crash, or about the Holocaust in Europe under the Nazis, or whatever? If you've ever entertained such a thing, how could God allow this thing to happen? Then, as far as I'm concerned, the way to deal with this is to realize that if I ask that kind of a question, it evidences the fact that my God isn't big enough. That I have been dealing with an intellectual construct which stands in the way. And I'm trying to understand God or to see God through limitations and through problems, and it never works. Any of you who happen to be actors or dancers or musicians know that the unhappy lot or the happy lot, however you prefer to look at it, of a person in your profession is that you always have to prove yourself. Of course, if you become a great star, it may not be the case, but when you're going for auditions and so forth, you got to start all over again. You got to prove your wares. You got to constantly show that you can dance and you can act and so forth, so that you'll be selected out of the line and so forth. With many persons, God is always auditioning. God is always on the frying pan. He's always under the Inquisition. We're always saying, oh God, how could you allow this to happen? If you're so great, prove it. You know, Read Job in the Old Testament. This was Job's lament, you see. He couldn't understand how God could do this to him. He was such a righteous person. He was trying to justify himself, and the only way he could justify himself was to imply that God was unholy, or that God was against him. Now, it sounds ridiculous when you see it in that way, but if we even sense very subtly and secretly within ourselves this experience of seeing some problem and saying, oh, how could such a thing happen when there is only love, when there's only God? Then I say that's a very good challenge to us to get a larger concept. Someone asked me this noon, but you referred, for instance, to the Holocaust in Europe. And he said, I have forever have people ask me, you know, if metaphysics is all that great and if the law of consciousness is valid and if the idea of the omnipresence of God is great, how could this happen? How could it happen? And my feeling about this is, let's don't get involved in simplistic answers. I could give you an answer. I'd be kidding myself if I thought the answer was the true and vital answer. We can get involved in all sorts of rationalizations. We can say, well, if truth is truth and consciousness is what it is, then there must have been something in their consciousness or it wouldn't have happened. That's an easy simplification. And in the largest sense, obviously, there may be certain aspects of this true, but we can't sweep it under the rug in that easy way. But the important thing is, whenever such a question comes up to me, don't try to solve problems in calculus before you understand the mathematics of 2 + 2 = 4. As long as you are seeing 2 + 3 = 4, then you're always going to be baffled in any kind of an arithmetical problem. And the farther you go up in the mathematical scale or hierarchy, the more confused you're going to be. The important thing is to get into the consciousness, into the awareness of being, of the whole, before you try to understand any of the parts. Because if you try to understand the parts before you realize the whole, then you're going to have only confusion. And only the problem of all of your prejudices and your fears and your insecurities constantly coming up, and you wind up, of course, with no help and no peace, no comfort, whatever. Work to get the realization of wholeness, the realization of being. And any of the difficulties that you experience, whether you see them on the television screen or read them in the newspapers or see them on the street or in your office or in your home or in your life or your neighborhood or whatever, any of these problems that keep rearing their head, the need is not to say, how could that happen? But how can I, first of all, make the adjustment in consciousness so that I can know that there is only God? And that out of that realization of the allness, the beingness of God, that then my perception is going to be clearer so that I will not see by appearances, I will see, as Jesus says, righteously. I will see clearly. I will see out of the process of oneness, of wholeness. And then, first of all, my seeing is going to be a healing process, and I'm going to be on the side of solutions rather than the side of problems. Secondly, and gradually and progressively, I will develop an understanding that will satisfy me as to why. But that's only secondary. As long as I insist on the why, I'm falling down on my responsibility. I'm still seeing it, reacting to it, and putting the whole weight of my consciousness on the side of the problem. Therefore, we have a constant challenge before us. You know, when we say we're going to do some homework, the homework is all out there. It's in the newspapers, it's on the streets, it's in our office, it's around us. That's your homework. And the need is to continually expand your awareness to the realization of the allness of God. Now, in the series of lessons that we gave on Sunday a few weeks ago, which was the quest for wholeness, we constantly referred to what I call the principle of unitivity. Here's another of the facets of the jewel, which I think is very relevant here. This was the idea that wherever spirit is at all, spirit as another name for God, if you will, or being, wherever spirit is at all, the whole of spirit must be. And because God, or spirit, or being, if you will, is omnipresent, the whole of spirit must be present in its entirety at every point in space at the same time. On certain levels of consciousness, a person would say, well, that's just plain mumbo-jumbo. But it's a very important challenge to get that realization. We talk about the omnipresence of God, and I wonder how many of you have ever thought, and perhaps have had this suspicion come up in a time when you're experiencing some difficulty and you're trying to get into the presence or get the presence into you. You ever thought that if God is omnipresent, he sure spread himself mighty thin? And there's that feeling that almost unconsciously, I wish that God in his omnipresence would get himself together and work in my behalf, you know. Now these are ridiculous, facetious thoughts, but they're the kind of things that so often go on in our subconsciousness. But this is a very important realization, that in the allness and the wholeness, the beingness of the infinite, in a way beyond intellectual comprehension, I don't think the human mind can actually conceive of this as being valid in terms of the facts of the things we deal with and see and relate to and so forth. In a way beyond intellectual comprehension, the whole is always present at any given point in its entirety. The whole of divine mind. You may talk about divine mind, and quite often there is this thought again of divine mind as being another name for God, and it's out there, and I'm trying to reach divine mind so that divine mind will give me ideas. The whole of divine mind is at the point of my mind in its entirety. Therefore, my mind is a smile on the face of divine mind. Does that startle you? My mind is an activity of divine mind. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to reach for. My mind, my intelligence, my creative capacities are simply the outforming process and the expression of divine mind and the Creator in its entirety, wholly. There's nowhere to go. Therefore, there is no person. It doesn't make any difference how great, how spiritual, how creative, how successful. There's no person that has any greater access to God mind, or has within him any greater amount of the fullness of God than I have or that you have. You may say, well, that sounds good metaphysically, but in terms of the realistic experience of everyday life, sometimes there is a feeling, well, I know that God created me, but I sometimes have a feeling that I was standing behind the door when he passed out the creativity, or some people say when he passed out the brains, or whatever, the talents. I don't have any. So there's this downgrading of ourselves, almost as if we were shortchanged, and we sometimes grow up in our home relationships, perhaps feeling somewhat insecure because maybe we had a mother or a father that put us down and criticized us, and so we feel that we're all thumbs and we're not able to do certain things and so forth. And quite often we carry that over into our spiritual relationship, that we feel that maybe God has blessed some people more than others, has endowed certain people more than others. We've said that. We've talked about it and shared about it. Isn't it marvelous how God has endowed this person? And quite often when we say that, it's the same way we say, isn't he great, but I'm such a numbskull. You know, isn't it great how God has endowed this person with such tremendous abilities? Usually we say, gee, I wish I had some of them. And so there's this constant sense of putting ourselves down. I don't mean that everybody has the same outward manifestations of the divine process, because each of us is unique. And we shouldn't even try to be like somebody else. We should only try to fulfill our uniqueness, because that's all we can ever be, is the unique individualization of ourselves. But each of us, you and me and anybody else, is a smile on the face of divine mind, is an outward focusing of the infinite creative process. Each of us is being him, being you, being me. That's the truth. And our need is to look beyond the facts and to relate to the truth and identify with it. And when we identify with it, then we begin to form it, first of all, into what we call affirmations or statements. But we affirm the truth or treat with certain affirmations of truth, not to make it so, but actually to identify ourselves with this divine flow so that we become more and more conscious that it is the truth. Not to make it, but to accept it, you see. So therefore, we begin to realize that prayer, treatment, affirmation, and so forth is not a process of trying to get answers or to get God to answer our problems. God is not a great answer man, a great Mr. Fix-It, a great Mr. Anthony. You see, so often we have the cliches, well, you know, I believe that God can help you anytime. Or we say sometimes God can heal me, God can guide me. Well, it may be difficult for you at some times, but maybe in the context of what we're talking about tonight, you'll be willing to challenge yourself with the thought that God can help you. God can't heal you. God can't guide you. Not in the way in which we normally think of those terms. Because if we think that God can heal me, I wonder if you've ever allowed yourself to go beyond in the awareness when we say, if God can heal me, then why doesn't he? You see, we say, well, I didn't mean that, because I meant God can heal me because God is life. Well, then why not say God is life? Why say God can heal me? God doesn't heal. God isn't a healer. God isn't an answer man. God isn't one that is always there ready to guide you and direct you where you want to go. God is the guiding principle. God is the flow of life. God is a relentless, changeless process and force within you that's seeking always to fulfill your needs and to direct you in the total implementation of the things that your mind seeks to do. So it's like a principle, and the principle is always working. It's not a personalized force that says, well, there's Eric there. He certainly is working very hard at this business. He's trying, and I'll give him points for that. We'll give him a little merit badge. And if he keeps on, then I'll give him a little better guidance, and I'll give him a little more money, and I'll help him to do things in a little more effective way, you see. Well, of course, that sounds ridiculous, but so often in our human consciousness, we follow this kind of reasoning. So we want to get a larger and larger and larger concept and awareness of God as being, as allness, as wholeness, and to begin to see ourselves in terms of eachness. Well, next week we're going to move along into another aspect, the law of unfoldment. We're dealing so far with the beingness of the infinite process. Now we're going to think about how being becomes each of us. The being me, and how it can be implemented, how can let this process of unfoldment become a very real force in our life. So we'll continue with this next week, and we invite you to join us again.